In the summer of 1940, Germany appeared unstoppable. France had fallen, the Low Countries were occupied, and Hitler's Wehrmacht dominated continental Europe. Confident in his victories, Hitler turned his attention to Britain, believing that the island nation, isolated and dependent on imports, would collapse under sustained military pressure. Hitler's strategy for the invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, relied on neutralizing the Royal Air Force and securing control of the English Channel. In July 1940, the Luftwaffe intensified reconnaissance missions over southern England, gathering intelligence on airfields, ports, and radar installations. Civilians in London and southern coastal towns noticed the increase in overflights, but the British government, under Prime Minister Winston Churchill, reassured the public that defenses were robust. Inside the German High Command, confidence was high. Generals such as Walther von Brauchitsch, Franz Halder, and Gerd von Rundstedt believed Britain would capitulate once the Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority. Hitler, convinced that moral pressure and bombing could break British resolve, directed the Luftwaffe to target airfields, radar stations, and key infrastructure. "They cannot resist forever," Hitler asserted in a high-level meeting at the Reich Chancellery in early August. "Once their defenses crumble, Britain will be ours." Initial Luftwaffe operations beginning in early August met fierce resistance. Fighter Command, commanded by Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, implemented the Dowding system, integrating radar, ground observers, and coordinated fighter responses. Civilians in London reported seeing the early dogfights, watching the sky light up with tracer fire and explosions. The first encounters of the Battle of Britain demonstrated that the British air defense was resilient, flexible, and coordinated. German generals quickly noticed that the Luftwaffe's superiority was not guaranteed. Pilots encountered well-trained RAF squadrons and losses mounted. Major General Albert Kesselring, overseeing Luftwaffe operations, expressed concern in communications to Berlin. "The pilots are courageous, but the British coordination is exceptional. Our losses are rising faster than anticipated." Hitler dismissed these early warnings with confidence, insisting that the British would soon capitulate under pressure. By September 1940, the Luftwaffe shifted strategy, targeting major cities in what would become known as the Blitz. London, Coventry, Birmingham, and other industrial centers were bombed nightly. Civilians endured air raids, blackout restrictions, and destruction of homes, yet morale remained surprisingly resilient. Churchill's speeches broadcast to the nation inspired defiance. "We shall never surrender. Our cause is just and our people will endure." Inside the Wolfschans and other German command posts, generals and staff officers expressed growing frustration. Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, documented in his diary, "Hitler underestimates the British spirit. Losses are mounting, civilians endure the bombings with remarkable courage. This will complicate any plans for invasion." Despite mounting evidence, Hitler continued to demand total focus on defeating Britain. Meetings with Reinhard Heydrich and Luftwaffe leaders became tense, as conflicting reports of air losses and industrial resilience filtered in. The failure of Operation Sea Lion to advance planning as quickly as Hitler demanded caused friction among generals. Gerd von Rundstedt warned, "We cannot invade without securing air superiority. This campaign is dragging longer than anticipated and Britain adapts daily." Civilians in Britain, including Londoners, witnessed the Blitz firsthand. Families huddled in shelters while fires consumed neighborhoods above them, yet the population's resolve stiffened. Air raid wardens, volunteers, and the Home Guard contributed to a collective effort of survival and resilience. Reports reached German intelligence that morale remained high, challenging the assumption that bombing alone could force surrender. By October 1940, German High Command convened in Berlin to assess progress. Hitler demanded estimates for the collapse of Britain within weeks. Luftwaffe reports detailed industrial destruction, infrastructure damage, and civilian casualties, yet generals emphasized that the RAF continued to operate effectively. Erhard Milch, Luftwaffe inspector, remarked, "They endure, they repair, and they fight back. The people and the pilots are not broken." Hitler's reaction was one of disbelief and anger. He could not reconcile the reports of British resilience with his expectation of rapid collapse. He questioned the competence of his generals and staff, accusing them of exaggerating RAF capabilities. "They will yield," Hitler barked in a meeting with Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe. "If they resist, it is only temporary. Continue the pressure and they will break." Despite Hitler's insistence, Luftwaffe losses continued to rise. The Royal Air Force's effective use of radar, tactics like the Fingerfour formation, and decentralized command allowed British pilots to respond efficiently. Civilians reported the morale and defiance of Londoners, noting that life persisted despite destruction. Generals in Berlin realized the British people were unlikely to surrender merely from bombing and threat of invasion. Meanwhile, Churchill's rhetoric and leadership became an ever-present obstacle to German expectations. Civilians, journalists, and even German intelligence noted his speeches. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. These words, aimed at RAF pilots, also resonated with the wider population, demonstrating that Britain's morale was anchored by leadership and unity. By late November 1940, frustration among German generals reached its peak. Meetings in the Reich Chancellery became heated. Walther von Brauchitsch expressed concern. "We have inflicted damage, but the British recover quickly. They do not falter. Operation Sea Lion remains unfeasible under current conditions." Hitler's insistence on continuation of bombing, despite strategic setbacks, led to tension and uncertainty within the command structure. At the same time, British civilians and military observers reported the effectiveness of their own countermeasures. Anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons, and civil defense initiatives combined to limit the impact of Luftwaffe raids. RAF pilot Douglas Bader, flying sorties over southern England, recalled in memoirs that morale on both the ground and in the air remained high despite losses. German intelligence intercepted reports describing these facts, forcing generals to confront the reality of their underestimation. By December 1940, German High Command faced mounting evidence. Britain's resilience was genuine, organized, and widespread. Civilians endured bombings, repaired damage, and supported war efforts through rationing, volunteering, and civil defense. The RAF, despite being outnumbered in some engagements, maintained operational capability. Strategic bombing had failed to break civilian or military morale. In meetings during early 1941, Hitler and his generals began to acknowledge the limitations of their approach. Arguments over the feasibility of Operation Sea Lion intensified. Goering attempted to reassure Hitler of eventual success through continued bombing, but reports of RAF effectiveness and civilian defiance increasingly undermined confidence. Franz Halder recorded growing doubts. "The assumption that Britain would yield has proven false. We cannot force submission through terror alone." The failure of strategic bombing campaigns, combined with Churchill's leadership and the British public's resilience, marked a pivotal shift in German thinking. General discussions in Berlin increasingly focused on alternative strategies, reassessing the war on the Eastern Front and preparing for broader conflict. Hitler, initially in denial, faced the impossible truth. Britain would not surrender voluntarily, and Operation Sea Lion was unachievable without securing air superiority first. By January 1941, the Blitz had entered its fifth month. London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, and other major cities bore the scars of relentless Luftwaffe bombardment. Civilians endured nightly raids, sleep deprivation, and destruction of homes, yet the public remained steadfast. Air raid wardens, volunteers, and ordinary citizens organized firefighting teams, cleared rubble, and protected vital infrastructure. Despite devastation, morale was remarkably resilient. Inside the German High Command, the reality of Britain's unbroken resolve became increasingly difficult to ignore. Hitler, convinced that terror bombing would force surrender, grew frustrated as reports continued to emphasize British endurance. Albert Kesselring, Luftwaffe commander, warned in January meetings, "The losses among our bomber units are rising, yet their defenses remain effective. Civilians and pilots alike are undaunted." Generals and staff officers in Berlin debated strategy. Franz Halder documented in his diary, "Reports from reconnaissance indicate the British economy, industry, and public spirit have adapted. Bombing raids destroy property but not morale." Hitler refuses to accept this reality. Tension in these meetings was palpable. Staff officers feared the strategic miscalculation could jeopardize Germany's broader objectives. Luftwaffe pilots returned from missions exhausted and demoralized. Squadrons faced increasingly sophisticated RAF tactics, including coordinated fighter interceptions, radar-guided responses, and deceptive maneuvers. German generals grew increasingly alarmed. Walther von Brauchitsch questioned the continued reliance on bombing. "We are inflicting damage, yes, but the British recover daily. This approach is not decisive." Without air superiority, Operation Sea Lion remains impossible. On the ground in London, civilians observed resilience firsthand. Families huddled in underground shelters as incendiary bombs rained down above. Children were evacuated to the countryside, while adults took shifts organizing emergency services. Reports reached Germany that the civilian population remained disciplined and unbroken. For many generals, this contradicted Hitler's assumption that terror could secure a quick victory. By February 1941, the German High Command convened to evaluate progress. Hitler insisted on continuation, demanding increased pressure on industrial targets and port facilities. Hermann Goering, commanding the Luftwaffe, assured him, "The campaign continues. We will eventually compel surrender." Yet staff officers privately expressed doubt. Kesselring noted, "The British repair and adapt faster than anticipated. Their pilots fight with extraordinary skill. This is not a temporary delay. It is sustained resistance." The psychological toll on German leadership grew. Meetings were tense and confrontational. Generals debated shifting priorities toward the Eastern Front, questioning the viability of an invasion of Britain. Hitler resisted these suggestions, still believing in the eventual collapse of British morale. Franz Halder recorded, "It is increasingly clear that our initial assumptions were flawed." Yet Hitler refuses to acknowledge the limits of air power against an unyielding population. Across Britain, civilians displayed resourcefulness and unity. Anti-aircraft batteries, barrage balloons, and fighter coordination limited Luftwaffe effectiveness. Fire brigades and volunteer networks repaired damage with speed and efficiency. Stories of heroism circulated, from ordinary citizens rescuing neighbors to RAF pilots intercepting bombing raids. German intelligence intercepted reports detailing these acts, further eroding confidence in the Blitz as a decisive tool. In March 1941, British intelligence operations added another layer of difficulty. Deception campaigns, coded radio transmissions, and counterintelligence initiatives frustrated German strategic calculations. Civilians became integral to civil defense, organizing shelters, rationing, and volunteer efforts. Every act of defiance, however subtle, reinforced Germany's emerging recognition. Britain would not yield. German generals increasingly confronted the limits of Operation Sea Lion. High-level meetings reflected rising tension between Hitler and his advisors. Kesselring, von Brauchitsch, and Halder debated alternative strategies, acknowledging that the original plan underestimated the British capacity for resistance. Hitler's denial persisted, but evidence mounted. British morale, civil organization, and military resilience were intact. Civilians in industrial centers witnessed nightly destruction but refused to surrender their resolve. Factories resumed production quickly, and skilled workers repaired equipment, bridges, and communication lines. British newspapers, despite bomb damage, continued publication. Radio broadcasts communicated government updates, morale messages, and calls for unity. German generals noted that bombing was failing to achieve psychological collapse. By April 1941, Hitler reluctantly accepted that air raids alone would not force Britain into submission. Generals cautiously suggested scaling back bombing campaigns, redirecting resources elsewhere. Meetings in Berlin grew increasingly candid. Halder wrote in his diary, "Operation Sea Lion is infeasible without air superiority. The British endure both air attacks and propaganda." Hitler begins to grasp the limits of our assumptions. RAF pilots such as Johnny Johnson and Douglas Bader continued to disrupt Luftwaffe operations, defending cities and ports with remarkable effectiveness. Civilians provided critical intelligence, spotting enemy aircraft and guiding anti-aircraft defenses. These combined efforts demonstrated to German leadership that Britain's capacity for defense, both military and civilian, was formidable. In London, daily life persisted despite ongoing raids. Civilians organized relief efforts, rebuilt neighborhoods, and maintained education for children. Witnessing this, German intelligence reports increasingly noted the extraordinary resilience of the population. Generals began to understand that psychological and material damage alone would not compel surrender. By May 1941, the Luftwaffe faced unsustainable losses. German air commanders reported over 1,700 aircraft lost in the previous months, with British operational capabilities largely intact. Generals documented that British airfields, radar stations, and factories were repaired or rebuilt quickly. Hitler was forced to acknowledge that bombing had failed to break the nation's will. The German High Command convened a decisive series of meetings. Hitler expressed disbelief and anger, questioning why the British persisted. Goering argued that continued pressure would eventually work, but generals countered with reports of mounting pilot casualties, resilient civilians, and operational failure. The tension in these rooms reflected the growing realization. Britain would not surrender voluntarily. Civilian defiance became central to German strategic reassessment. Reports from London, Manchester, and Coventry illustrated that the population endured hardship, yet morale remained unbroken. RAF effectiveness, public organization, and civic responsibility created a nation that could withstand sustained military pressure. Generals concluded that alternative strategies, rather than terror bombing, were necessary to achieve strategic goals. By June 1941, German High Command had reached a reluctant consensus. Operation Sea Lion could not succeed under current circumstances. Hitler's initial confidence in rapid British capitulation had been shattered by civilian endurance, RAF success, and logistical resilience. Strategic focus shifted toward the Eastern Front, as generals and staff reconciled with the reality that Britain would not surrender, and Operation Sea Lion was effectively shelved. By mid-1941, the German High Command had reluctantly accepted the limits of their campaign against Britain. Operation Sea Lion, once the centerpiece of Hitler's strategic vision, was indefinitely postponed. Generals and staff officers recognized the resilience of Britain, the effectiveness of the RAF, and the indomitable spirit of the British people as decisive factors. In Berlin, Hitler convened meetings with his top military advisors. Tension was palpable. Walter von Brauchitsch and Franz Halder presented data on Luftwaffe losses, RAF strength, and the resilience of British cities. Hitler initially rejected the reports, insisting that further bombing could compel surrender. Goering assured him, "We will continue the raids, patience will yield results." Yet intelligence and first-hand accounts from occupied Europe painted a starkly different picture. Generals debated alternative strategies. Halder documented growing concern. The assumption that Britain would succumb to terror alone has proven false. Continued air raids destroy material but do not break morale. The RAF remains operational, civilians endure, and British leadership is unwavering. Operation Sea Lion cannot succeed without air superiority. In London, civilians maintained an extraordinary degree of resilience. Families rebuilt homes damaged in previous raids. Children returned from evacuation to continue schooling. Firefighters and emergency personnel worked tirelessly, while volunteers organized shelters and aid for the wounded. Reports from German intelligence confirmed that these efforts had succeeded in maintaining national morale. Hitler's disbelief turned to frustration as Luftwaffe losses mounted. Pilots under pressure to deliver results faced an unbroken enemy. Erhard Milch, inspecting operational reports, warned that continued losses were unsustainable. "The pilots are exhausted, replacements are insufficient." Britain remains defiant. Further escalation risks collapse of our air units. Throughout the summer of 1941, German generals reluctantly accepted the reality that Britain would not surrender. Meetings became increasingly tense as Hitler oscillated between denial and acknowledgement. Gerd von Rundstedt advised, "We must focus on other fronts. Britain cannot be subdued by bombing alone." Hitler, still unwilling to abandon the goal entirely, began redirecting strategic attention toward the Eastern Front and other theaters. RAF operations continued to disrupt German plans. Pilots such as Douglas Bader and Johnny Johnson intercepted raids, while radar networks provided early warning and coordinated fighter responses. Civilians contributed through civil defense, repair efforts, and intelligence reporting. Reports of resilience reached the Reich, reinforcing the emerging consensus: Britain could not be coerced into surrender. Inside the German High Command, the psychological impact of this realization was profound. Hitler's confidence in quick victories across Europe had been shaken. Generals recorded in diaries and meeting notes the extraordinary effect of civilian and military morale on strategic outcomes. Halder wrote, "We have underestimated the importance of leadership, national spirit, and civilian endurance. Britain is a fortress, not merely a nation. This miscalculation has significant consequences for our war plans." As autumn 1941 approached, German officers began adjusting priorities. Operation Sea Lion remained on hold indefinitely, while planning and resources shifted toward the Eastern Front and North Africa. The failure to subdue Britain was no longer theoretical, it was operational reality. Generals and staff officers accepted that continued bombing campaigns, while damaging, could not achieve strategic victory. Reports highlighted the role of British leadership in sustaining national morale. Churchill's speeches, including the iconic "We shall fight on the beaches" address, resonated deeply. Civilians were inspired to endure hardship, support the war effort, and maintain unity. German generals, observing these effects, acknowledged that leadership could compensate for material disadvantage, further reinforcing the impossibility of forcing British surrender. The failure of Operation Sea Lion and the Blitz represented a turning point in German strategic thinking. Hitler's initial confidence was replaced by growing awareness of limitations. Meetings in Berlin increasingly reflected candid assessments of Britain's resilience, RAF capabilities, and the unbroken spirit of the population. Generals documented that psychological and civil resistance were as significant as military factors in sustaining Britain's defense. By the end of 1941, German High Command had fully recognized that Britain would not capitulate. Strategic bombing campaigns continued sporadically, but Operation Sea Lion was indefinitely shelved. Hitler's attention shifted decisively to the Soviet Union, initiating plans for Operation Barbarossa while the Western Front stabilized. The realization of British resilience marked a pivotal moment in WWII, demonstrating that determined leadership, civilian endurance, and military coordination could withstand even the most intense military pressure. Civilians in Britain, often unaware of the precise impact of their collective efforts, had become the backbone of national resistance. Londoners, Mancunians, Liverpudlians, and citizens across the country displayed courage, organization, and unwavering spirit. Their resilience directly contributed to the German High Command's recognition of the campaign's failure. In occupied Europe, German generals and staff officers confronted the psychological and operational reality. The British people under Churchill's leadership could not be broken. The strategic consequences were immediate. Resources intended for Operation Sea Lion were reallocated. Luftwaffe forces were redeployed to support campaigns on the Eastern Front and in North Africa. German naval forces adjusted plans, acknowledging that cross-channel operations were no longer feasible without total air dominance. Hitler's initial hubris, based on rapid victories in Europe, had been countered by the steadfastness of one nation. German diaries and intelligence reports from late 1941 reflect the growing sense of inevitability. Britain's resolve was unshakable. Officers described frustration, disbelief, and even admiration for the nation's capacity to endure. Halder wrote, "We underestimated the British will. Material power alone cannot compel a people to surrender. Their leadership, organization, and morale have created an indomitable nation." Meanwhile, civilians in Britain continued to contribute to the war effort. Industrial production, civil defense, RAF operations, and intelligence support created a multifaceted resistance to invasion. Reports from Germany confirmed that these combined efforts had thwarted the primary objective of Operation Sea Lion. Hitler and his generals were forced to acknowledge that Britain remained unbroken, a nation united in defense against tyranny. By December 1941, the realization was complete. Hitler convened a final series of meetings regarding the feasibility of invading Britain. Generals presented data emphasizing Luftwaffe losses, civilian resilience, and RAF effectiveness. Hitler, visibly frustrated, finally accepted that Operation Sea Lion was unachievable under existing circumstances. Strategic focus would now shift toward the Soviet Union and the Mediterranean, but the psychological victory of Britain remained intact.